It's Veterans for Peace from Broome County that has organized this. Veterans for Peace is part of an organization that has 140 chapters around the world. Although in Binghamton, there are a group of individuals from other veterans organizations that say we're not a real organization and they don't want us to parade with them. We feel very comfortable with Mark Twain today rather than marching down Main Street and Court Street in Binghamton. As nice as that might be to have people see the flag flying for Veterans for Peace. But we even have Veterans for Peace chapters in places like Japan, in Korea, in the United Kingdom, and in Ireland. And if you want to hear more about that later, that'd be great. We meet every second Saturday, every second Saturday of the month at the First Congregational Church. First Congregational Church is on the corner of Main and Front Street in Binghamton. That's 10 a.m. On our second Saturday, and we have our peace action people who meet right after. You can do both meetings or just one if you want. But Mark Twain must be smiling right now. He did have quite a sense of humor, for sure. That we're actually standing at his grave in opposition to American imperialism, because that's the heart of what Veterans for Peace is. Members of Veterans for Peace are sick of war, tired of war, want no more war, want to abolish war. Just as slavery was abolished, we believe that there will be a time, maybe not in our day, but there will be a time when war will be abolished. And that is the essence of what we stand for. And because of that, because we don't glorify Memorial Day or Armistice Day, in fact it's now called Veterans Day, where veterans are given free coffee and donuts at some places and parade along the street with their weapons on their shoulders, etc. We don't do that. We call it Armistice Day, which was the end of arms at the end of World War I. Mark was gone by then, but Mark went through the Spanish-American War as a critic. In fact, he became vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League. And the Anti-Imperialist League especially focused on the genocide that American soldiers were performing on the Filipino people. It was absolute horror. We know about My Lai, My Lai, but there were dozens of villages like that, many dozens, absolutely wiped out. Every man, woman, and child, pigs and chickens, and they were proud of it. This is where waterboarding started. This is where Douglas MacArthur got his start as a second lieutenant coming out of West Point. So he spoke about this, and he spoke about the treachery of super wealth, of Jay Gould and the robber barons that were ripping a people apart, the real enemies of the state. And so he appealed to people not to engage in conflict. So I think we have great gratitude to Mark Twain for that. And just, we'll wait for a second or two. I was just reading something by Sarah Churchill from The Economist. I don't know if she's a relation to V. Winston, but anyway, here's what she said. Because keep in mind that Mark is a veteran for peace because he used the term skedaddle. He skedaddled after 2 weeks in the Confederacy, right? He said, none of this. He took a stagecoach to Nevada. And, after a short period of time, because he had some experience in printing and writing, he became the writer that became the most famous American writer, probably of American history. But anyway, Sarah Churchill had this to say about Mark Twain. I thought it was important enough to jot down, and I don't want to misquote her. And she wrote this actually in 2010. That's when Mark said that his autobiography should be released. He died, don't forget, in 1910, so this was many years, 100 years after. She said, Sarah Churchill saying, "There are many humorous things in the world, among them the white man's notion that he is less savage than the other savages." He also said, "Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to." The autobiography adds, "Man is the only creature that kills for fun. He is the only one that kills in malice, the only one that kills for revenge. He is the only creature that has a nasty mind." Yesterday's New York Times had a big play on a young man who was as a lieutenant in Fallujah, the horror of Fallujah. Remember General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, who gave orders to the Marines and the infantry army to kill every living thing. Every living thing. They say cats and dogs, yeah, cats and dogs too. Mad Dog Mattis. He eventually, of course, rose to great ranks in Trump's administration. But yesterday's New York Times had about 4 pages devoted to a young lieutenant who is now a writer, and he wrote about the great joy that his troops had, as much fear and death and injury in Fallujah. In fact, get this, on the idea that men kind of like to kill or even smile or laugh, like the video that was taken with Americans laughing as we killed first responders in Iraq. Remember that? Well, ask Chelsea Manning, because eventually it got to Julian Assange, and that's why Chelsea Manning went to prison, because he was telling the truth. He showed the actual video of machine gunning first responders and the guys laughing. Well, here's what this young man says. The author telling about it. So there are 3 men in black out in the open. I don't see them until they are dead in front of us. One of them is lying on his side with his head resting on the curb like it's a pillow. The machine gunner, a kid named Benji, looks back at me smiling. Looks back at me smiling. That says an awful lot of what the character building is that we have in this country, and that Mark Twain was trying to point out over 100 years ago. So I think that's about it on Mark. And what I'd like to introduce now is Larry Evans, who has, and he'll tell you, a relative just over the hill at the National Cemetery. This is not the National Cemetery. This is a public-private cemetery where the Langdon family, of course, had their grave here. But if you take a short walk over the hill, you'll come to the Confederacy. Let Larry tell you about this, about why that cemetery is there, and about his great-great-great-uncle. Is it 3 greats or?
Great-great-grand.
Great-great-grand-uncle. Okay, thanks, Larry.
We're here, we have a unique situation where we have, it's the only place there is where we have somebody of Mark Twain's stature who had a way of bringing to the attention what the cost of war was, and so people would have a better understanding of it forever. And right next to this area where you are right now is a national cemetery, which was first opened up in the Civil War. And the reason for that was that Elmira was the site of the, they referred to it as Elmira, but later in the Civil War, instead of doing parolees and prisoner exchange, they had prisoner war camps set up north and south. So in 1864, I think it was around July, it went for about a year, they opened the prisoner war camp in downtown Elmira down by the river. That's where the barracks were. It was the old barracks where they mustered troops, including relatives of mine in those barracks. And it was open about a year, and it went through a horrible winter and a horrible flooding in the camp in the spring, and of about 12,000 POWs that were there, approximately 3,000 were casualties, which was close to 25%, which was only second in the war to the well-known Andersonville. So this was a very horrible situation in Elmira, and they had a large number of burials to do, so they got access to an area right next to the city cemetery. And there was a gentleman named John Jones, I believe his name was, and he is actually at one time in his life he had been a slave, but he lived as a citizen in Elmira, and he was in charge of the burials, and he insisted that before he buried anybody in that cemetery that they would have a name on it. So when we walk over to that cemetery, you'll notice the Confederate section. There are very, very few unknowns. 90% of them have names, and that's one of the gifts that that former slave gave to the victims of this prisoner of war camp, and the descendants. I mean, descendants from the South can come up and locate and look at the remains of their ancestors, which is quite a thing to accomplish. But personally, I had my great, as we said, my great-great-grand uncle, John Evans, was a resident with his, by the way, he had 3 brothers that went to the war, and their father went to the war. So his brother was my direct ancestor. So all of these people we've tracked down genealogically and everything else. But John, he's buried right next to the Confederate. As we cross over into the National Cemetery, the first thing you see is about 3,000 graves. At the head of it is a huge monument that the descendants of the Confederacy put there, a giant monument. John and other Union people are buried around that cemetery. We'll also notice there's a big monument in the center of the cemetery off to the side. Part of the tragedy was that after the war was over, they were transporting some of the remaining POWs south back home, and there was a tragic accident with the train. And unfortunately, all of the Confederate and Union guards that were on it were killed. So you'll notice there's a massive grave there also, next to the other graves. So, but after the Civil War was over, in about 1866, 67, I believe, in Waterloo, New York, now this is history, there were probably other ones, but this is historically, they started what they called Decoration Day, and that's what this is. This is Decoration Day. And what they did was the whole community came out, and they did have ceremonies and maybe parade, but the focal point was the graves. And they went and decorated those graves on that day. And that's why this is so important. We're continuing by doing what we're doing today, with visiting Mark Twain and visiting the graves and honoring them with flowers that we're intending to carry on a tradition of remembrance and reflection of the cost of this tragic war. And we can't do much about that, but we can learn from it and grow from it, and maybe have a say in preventing more graves in the future to have to put flowers on. That's why we're here. But that's why this site is this is all sacred ground throughout here. So we'll be visiting the National Cemetery at the end of this, okay?
Mary is well aware of the fact that the 3,000 Confederate soldiers buried down here died within months. They came and started coming in July of 1864, and it was all over with, of course, the war in April. They stayed on here until July. 3,000 out of the 12,000 died, right? Malnutrition, diphtheria, even some smallpox. A good number of them died along the Chemung, right, Larry, along the Chemung River, where they froze to death during the winter of 1865. We're going to honor Mark Twain a bit more here. Jim Clune, who's president of Peace Action in Binghamton, will be starting a reading of Mark Twain's famous war prayer. And he'll be joined by another individual who I'll introduce later on after he makes his appearance, because he's a mysterious stranger. And then John Patterson will direct you about taking the flowers down to the National Cemetery. Jim?
Mark Twain's war prayer. It was a time of great and exalting excitement. The country was up in arms, the war was on. In every breast burned the holy fire of patriotism. The drums were beating, the bands were playing, the toy pistols popping, the bunched firecrackers hissing and spluttering. On every hand and far down the receding and fading spreads of roofs and balconies, a fluttering wilderness of flags flashed in the sun. Daily the young volunteers marched down the wide avenue, gay and fine in their new uniforms. The proud fathers and mothers and sisters and sweethearts cheering them on, with voices choked with happy emotion as they swung by. Nightly the packed mass meetings listened, panting, to patriot oratory, which stirred the deepest deeps of their hearts, and which they interrupted at briefest intervals with cyclones of applause, the tears running down their cheeks the while. And in the churches the pastors preached devotion to flag and country and invoked the God of battles, beseeching his aid in our good cause in outpouring of fervent eloquence which moved every listener. It was indeed a glad and gracious time, and the half-dozen rash spirits that ventured to disapprove of the war and cast a doubt upon its righteousness straightway got such a stern and angry warning that for their personal safety's sake they quickly shrank out of sight and offended no more in that way. Sunday morning came. The next day the battalions would leave for the front. The church was filled. The volunteers were there, their faces alight with material dreams, visions of a stern advance, the gathering momentum, the rushing charge, the flashing sabers, the flight of the foe, the tumult, the enveloping smoke, the fierce pursuit, the surrender. Then, home from the war, bronzed heroes welcomed, adored, submerged in the golden seas of glory. With the volunteers sat their dear ones, proud, happy, and envied by their neighbors and friends who had no sons and brothers to send forth to the field of honor, there to win for the flag, or failing, die the noblest of noble deaths. The service proceeded. A war chapter from the Old Testament was read. The first prayer was said. It was followed by an organ burst that shook the building, and with one impulse the house rose with glowing eyes and beating hearts, and poured out that tremendous invocation, God the all-terrible, thou who ordainest, thunder thy clarion and lightning thy sword. Then came the long prayer. None could remember the like of it for passionate pleading and moving and beautiful language. The burden of its supplication was that an ever merciful and benignant Father of us all would watch over our noble young soldiers and aid, comfort, and encourage them in their patriotic work. He would bless them, shield them in his mighty hand, make them strong and confident, invincible in the bloody onset, help them to crush the foe, grant to them and to their flag and country imperishable honor and glory. An aged stranger entered and moved with slow and noiseless step up the main aisle, his eyes fixed upon the minister, his long body clothed in a robe that reached to his feet, his head bare, his white hair descending in a frothy cataract to his shoulders, his seamy face unnaturally pale even to ghastliness. With all eyes following him and wondering, he made his silent way, without pausing, and ascended to the preacher's side and stood there waiting. With shut eyes, the preacher, unconscious of his presence, continued his moving prayer, and at last finished it with the words, uttered in fervent appeal, "Bless our arms, grant us the victory. O Lord our God, Father and Protector of our land and flag." The stranger touched his arm, motioned him to step aside, which the startled minister did, and took his place.
I come from the throne, bearing a message from Almighty God. He has heard the prayer of his servant, your shepherd, and will grant it if such be your desire after I, his messenger, have explained to you its import, that is, its full import. For it is like unto many of the prayers of men, that in that it asks for more than he who utters it is aware of, except he pause and think. God's servant and yours has prayed his prayer. Has he paused and taken thought? Is it one prayer? For no, it is two, one uttered and one not. Both have reached the ear of him who heareth all supplications, the spoken and the unspoken. Ponder this. Keep it in mind. If you would beseech a blessing upon yourself, beware lest without intent you invoke a curse upon your neighbor at the same time. If you pray for the blessing of rain on your crop, which needs it, by that act, possibly, you are praying for a curse upon some neighbor's crop which may not need rain and would be injured by it. You have heard God's servant's prayer, the uttered part of it. I am commissioned by God to put into words the other part of it, that part which the pastor and also you in your hearts fervently prayed silently and ignorantly, unthinkingly. God granted it was so. You heard the words, "Grant us victory, O Lord our God." That is sufficient. The whole of the uttered prayer is compact into those pregnant words. Elaborations are not necessary. When you have prayed for victory, you have prayed for many unmentioned results, which follow victory, must follow it, cannot help but follow it. Upon the listening Spirit of God fell also the unspoken part of this prayer. He commandeth me now to put it into words. Listen. Lord our Father, our young patriots, idols of our hearts, go forth into battle. Be thou near them. With them in spirit we also go forth from the sweet peace of our beloved firesides to smite the foe. O Lord our God, help us tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their patriot dead. Help us to drown the thunder of the guns with the shrieks of their wounded writhing in pain. Help us to lay waste their humble homes with a hurricane of fire. Help us to wring the hearts of their unoffending widows with unavailing grief. Help us to turn them out roofless with their little children to wander unfriended in the wastes of their desolated land, in rags and hunger and thirst, sports of the sun flames in summer and the icy winds of winter, broken in spirit, worn with travail, imploring thee for the refuge of the grave, and denied it. For our sakes, who adore thee, Lord, blast their hopes, blight their lives, protract their bitter pilgrimage, make heavy their steps, water their way with their tears, stain the white snow with the blood of their wounded feet. We ask this, O Lord, in the spirit of love, of him who is the source of love, and who is the ever faithful refuge and friend of all that are sore beset and seek his aid with humble and contrite hearts. Amen. Ye have prayed it. If it is still your heart's desire, speak it. God's humble servant awaits. Amen.
It was afterwards believed that the man was a lunatic because there was no sense in what he said. Thus far, Mark Twain.
The gentleman who I didn't introduce is Reverend Art Suggs, who retired just recently from the very church where we have our meetings. Thank you very much, mysterious stranger. And we of course had to compete with the culture, right? But somehow or another, I think both of you got the message over loud and clear. Any comments? We can take this microphone off for anybody who would like to make a comment about anything that's going on in this situation. Mark Twain, or the Confederate graves that we'll be going to visit, or any particular topic in connection with war. You're welcome to come up and have a word. Please consider doing it. Sure.
Most of you are standing around this monument. Mark Twain asked that it have 4 symbols on it. And so on this side is a simple cross. On that side is the Alpha and the Omega, where Jesus said, I am the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. On this side is a symbol of the Trinity, and on this side is a classic symbol, the IHS, in hoc salvatorum, in Latin meaning salvation in his name. And the one we're referring to, of course, is the Prince of Peace. I came here and arrived actually a little bit before 9 o'clock because I enjoy being in the presence of cemeteries. And I just want to share one thought with you. I read long ago that granite dissolves just in weather to the tune of about 1 inch per 10,000 years. Marble, much softer, takes about 2,000 to 3,000 years for an inch of that to wear away. So if you look over at the whitish obelisk over there, it's much more worn, even though it's still approximately the same age as the granite obelisks. As well, we are surrounded by trees, many of whom are well over 100 years old. And I'd just like to, in the presence of these symbols of geologic time, I would like to remind you that you have somewhere between, say, 70 and 100 years. Let's not spend it fighting.
Wow, that was wonderful. What a great follow-up. I know you're saying, how can I top that? But anybody, again, is welcome to say a word. Jim, you want to? Go ahead. 2 Jims.
Jack sent out an email yesterday where the Pentagon had put out a tweet asking for veterans to speak about how their service affected them. And lo and behold, people answered them with the truth of post-traumatic stress syndrome, with the truth of traumatic brain injury, with the truth of alcoholism, with the truth of living with the thought of suicide every day. And I just started reading 3 or 4 of them, and I couldn't take it anymore, and I scrolled down. I don't know, there must have been 30 or 40 of them. I don't know how many there were. We need truth tellers. We need truth tellers. Telling the truth is the ultimate act of nonviolence. Nonviolence is always a choice. It's always an option. But then it becomes if you keep doing it, it becomes a habit. And if you keep doing that habit, it becomes a way of life. And pretty soon you realize nonviolently is the way we were supposed to live in the first place. I think of these young men and women who are still living with post-traumatic stress, thoughts of suicide, with substance abuse. And I'm thinking of all the 20 million people who have died in wars that the United States has waged since World War II, where the United States has either been actively involved in their deaths or complicit in them. And I think of the horrible suffering. We need to speak that truth. The truth that pain and suffering are real and immediate and have to be addressed now.
Jim Christner of Rochester Veterans for Peace. Do you like to say a word or two? Thanks, Jim.
What I have to say here this morning was prepared in anticipation of our being in the presence of the gravestones of the Civil War veterans. So I prevail upon you to imagine that. Imagine the resolve with which the young men whose graves lie here around us, marching to the consolidating cadence of beating drums, were carried away and thrust into a terrifying landscape of destruction, disillusionment, and death. Imagine as well the innumerable widely dispersed graves of comrades in arms, parents, wives, children, and other friends and relatives traumatized by the deaths of these young men so far from home. War is the great deceiver of the naive and overconfident. Hidden behind a veil of righteousness lurks a morass of unrelenting destruction and killing of such ghastly and excruciating horror that men are driven out of their wits. If such is the evil of war, why has humankind not put an end to it? War is profitable, some soldiers eager, all expendable. In an astounding declaration of manifest hubris, Henry Kissinger reportedly referred to military men as dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns for foreign policy. War proponents are able to coax the citizenry into war only with its consent. Henry Thoreau lamented, "There are thousands hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." So I encourage you to strike a terminal blow at the root of war by diligently seeking almighty truth, and with it smother the seductive but delusional clamoring for war that so devastates lives and brings penury and ruin to the land. Herbert Hoover warned, as war sanctifies murder, so it sanctifies the lesser immoralities of lives. We can never herd the world onto the paths of righteousness with the dogs of war. Wendell Berry shall have the last word. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings.
John Patterson is going to give some instructions now about walking over to the National Cemetery, which is a pretty easy walk. John, could you take over?
Thank you, Jack, and thank you everybody for being here. We have a number of flowers that were not bought at stores. They came from our homes that we'd like to place on the gravestones, places at the National Cemetery in remembrance of all those and the symbol that they came from us, not from a store. And We have them down in our car down the base of the hill here, so if you want to walk down or ride down, we'll meet you there, and we have a lot of flowers, so there's plenty for everybody to just pick and choose wherever you would like to place them. Thank you very much, and thank you for all that really have attended this. Thank you.
I also have some copies of some extra copies of the warfare if anybody wants to.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And you can also go online if you ever want to use it or give it to social studies teachers or English teachers who teach Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. I think this would be a good follow-up as well. John, what would be the easiest way to walk down this road here?
Just walk on that.
Yeah, there's one here. You can walk down this road or that road. And the National Cemetery then is just about 100 yards beyond that parking lot. Okay? So, thanks, so pardon? No, it's not too early. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah. It means it is a remembrance of war. We just hope that it's not going to be any sort of glorification of either those who died or of the day itself, but rather a remembrance, and to pray as Reverend Art Suggs prayed that we won't have to go through this again. That's our hope.
Great.
Yes.
It's actually 12 feet,
12 feet?
which is, how much of it is a fathom?
Oh, it is.
6
It's a Mark
feet.
Twain.
Oh,
It's a
Mark
Mark Twain. You got it.
How about
it's
that?
2 fathoms.
That'd be nice to
Yeah.
say on. That's a great
This
little
is,
story. Yeah.
12 feet tall, which is 2 fathoms, which is also a Mark Twain, which is what they used to, on the riverboats, steamboats on the Mississippi, they would throw a rock out, with a rope tied to it, and if the river was deep enough and the boat could draft 12 feet, then they would say Mark Twain,
Yeah.
as in Mark 2 fathoms. Yeah.
Oh.
And that's the significance of that height.
And what about the images there?
The images, well, this is Mark Twain, and that is Osip Gavrilovich, who was his son-in-law, and Clara Clemens married Osip Gavrilovich. And she erected that in memory of her husband and her father. Can you believe that top plaque was stolen about
I read about
a year or
that
two
a few years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you going to
It
go down
was
to film
recovered.
anybody down here?
About ready to be indicted because of this business with Bobby Baker.
And who is the grave there that...
His name's John J. Evans Jr., and he was in the Civil War, and he was injured in Georgia in 1863 and returned and came back to Elmira Heights. He died in the early 1900s and was buried here with honor. But he's one of 4 brothers that went into the Civil War, and their father went into the Civil War. So out of that group, 5 people went into the Civil War. One of them never returned, by the way.
Well, on that